Alright, so today we will look at the discussion on capital punishment. So as I told you earlier that the first book is a long deliberation on different topics, we may say, all related to administration of justice, reform of the administration and so on. And here this dialogue is taking place at the place of Cardinal John Morton, and Raphael is mostly speaking. Now the first book where this deliberation takes place, this is in the format of deliberative oratory. So as you may know that in ancient rhetoric, orations were of three types: deliberative, which discussed some concept or some idea, deliberated over it, like it could be philosophical concept or any other concept. Epideictic, that is oration that praises or blames something. So whatever is chosen as the topic of the oration, with the help of rhetoric, the orator will either praise that topic or blame it. So this kind of oration was called epideictic oratory. And the third was demonstrative, which was mostly used in the courts of law. The purpose of this kind of oration was to prove something, say to establish the crime of a criminal in the court of law. So that was demonstrative. Now in this book, the first book is all deliberation. So this is in the format of deliberative oration. And the second book is oration of praise or blame. Praise, mostly praise of utopia and its different customs, but also a blame of some of the customs. So that was epideictic, that is called epideictic oration. So here Raphael takes up the theme of capital punishment. You may remember the context that they were discussing the hanging of thieves and whether stealing should be punished with death sentence or not. Page 37 of this edition, Raphael says, but if they would thus say that the breaking of justice and the transgression of the laws is recompensed with this punishment and not the loss of the money, then why may not this extreme and rigorous justice well be called plain injury? So Raphael says that I think it not right, not justice, that the loss of money should cause the loss of man's life. So this is no recompense, or this is no adequate or appropriate justice. If somebody has lost money by taking away the life of the thief, that man cannot be recompensed. So from the point of view of law, whether the injury is sufficiently recompensated by the steps taken, by the punishment given to the criminal. For so cruel governance, so straight rules and unmerciful laws be not allowable, that if a small offence be committed, by and by the sword should be drawn. So for a small offence, the sword should not be drawn. This is not permissible. God commandeth us that we shall not kill, and be we then so hasty to kill a man for taking a little money. So alluding to the 10 commandments. So even according to Christian commandments, we should not kill, and how can we take away a man's life for such a slight offence? To be short, Moses' law, though it were ungentle and sharp, as a law that was given to bondmen, and them very obstinate, stubborn and stiff-necked, yet it punished theft by the purse and not with death. So to Christians, the laws of the Old Testament, they are very harsh because Christ preached the rule of love or the gospel of love. And before Christ, Moses' law would rule the conduct of Christians, and Moses' law was considered very harsh. But even then, even in Moses' law, stealing was not punished with with death sentence, but was punished with a fine, that is by the purse, and not by life. And let us not think that God in the new law of clemency and mercy, under the which He ruleth us with fatherly gentleness as His dear children, hath given us greater scope and license to the execution of cruelty one upon another. Raphael raises the Christian argument that this is the law of mercy in the new Christian dispensation, and God the Father won't give us permission to be so cruel to one another. And as they are discussing or deliberating over this question, then Raphael goes on to say about a country and its people, the Polylerites. So they live in Persia and they have a different law. But as concerning this matter, I allow the ordinance of no nation so well as that which I saw while I travelled abroad about the world, used in Persia among the people that commonly we call the Polylerites. So what is this difference in law between that of the Polylerites and the English law? They that in this land be attainted and convict of felony make restitution of that which they stole to the right owner, and not as they do in other lands to the king. So the felon or the thief will have to restitute or return or make good the property which he has stolen or destroyed to the person from whom he has taken it, and not to the king, which means that in countries where fines are imposed upon the thief, that fine goes to the king's treasury, and that does not serve the victim of this theft. Whereas the Polylerites, they make the thief return that money or that goods to the person from whom he has taken, and they themselves be condemned to be common labourers, and unless the theft be very heinous, they be neither locked in prison nor fettered in gyves, but be untied and go at large, labouring in the common works. So these thieves, they are not imprisoned or shackled, but they are free, but they are made to work. And by working, by doing hard labour, they are forced to generate that money by which they can recompense the victim of the theft. And he goes on to say how they can be identified very easily. Even though they are free, they are not in prison, but they are given a particular dress to wear from which they can be easily identified. And therefore, these serving men, as they are called here, they cannot escape. So if they try to escape from one state to another state, they will be immediately identified by their dress. And Raphael says that they cannot escape because of this dress. Unless they run naked, they will be caught. And even then, if they run naked, then that will also draw the attention of people. When I had thus spoken, saying moreover that I could see no cause why this order might not be had in England, with much more profit than the justice which the lawyer so highly praised. Nay, quoth the lawyer. So as Raphael said that this rule of the Polylerites, that can be imposed in England also. And then the lawyer opposed, because the lawyer represents here the English law. He said, this could never be so established in England but that it must needs bring the will public into great jeopardy and hazard. So he raises the problem of execution of this law. It cannot be implemented, but then the cardinal stops him by saying that you do not know unless you try it. Well, quoth the cardinal, yet it were hard to judge without a proof whether this order would do well here or no. But when the sentence of death is given, if then the king should command execution to be deferred and spared, and would prove this order and fashion, prove means test or experience. That is, he suggests that the king should defer or postpone the execution and try this order out. Taking away the privileges of all centuries, if then the proof should declare the thing to be good and profitable. What is the privilege of all centuries? That is the fine of the punishment that goes to the king's treasury. But the king would take away this privilege and, or we may say give up this privilege, and he will not accept the fine but see if it can be returned to the victim of the theft. Then it were well done that it were established. Else the condemned and reprieved persons may as well and as justly be put to death after this proof. So if this does not work, then it is established that it will not work in England, but the king may as well give it a try. So since the cardinal supported Raphael, then everybody seemed to accept it. When the cardinal had thus said, then every man gave great praise to my sayings, which a little before they had disallowed. So this proves the tendency of people to flatter the lord of the house or the powerful person. So all those who heard the cardinal support Raphael, they also started praising him. But most of all was esteemed that which was spoken of vagabonds, because the cardinal says that neither any jeopardy can in the mean space grow hereof. Yeah, and methinketh that these vagabonds may very well be ordered after the same fashion, against whom we have hitherto made so many laws and so little prevailed. So the cardinal at the end of his speech here talks about vagabonds. Now vagabondage was considered a great problem in Tudor England, and there were laws made against vagabonds and beggars, and the cardinal says that perhaps the vagabonds may also be controlled in this fashion, that instead of imprisoning them, killing them, punishing them, they might be made to work. So everybody praised this last part because that was the cardinal's addition. Then a character like a scoffer. A scoffer is like a bitter fool, a jester who scoffs at everybody. This character is introduced. The different characters which are discussed or introduced here in the first book, they would often remind us of Erasmus's Praise of Folly. In the Praise of Folly also Erasmus introduces fools, priests, friars and so on. And here also we find the character the fool, the lawyer, the priest and the friar. So similar to some extent to the Praise of Folly. But as you perhaps know that Erasmus is the Praise of Folly, we find there a gallery of fools or people belonging to different professions and trades. They are considered fools in some way or other by the oration of Dulcinea, or the oration of the fool, the lady who represents stupidity or foolishness. Now that is a satire, and More's book has this satirical aspect insofar as it discusses, like Erasmus, different people belonging to different status in society. And in the Praise of Folly, Erasmus talks of the wise fool, topos taken from the Bible, and here also more refers to the wise fool or to Solomon, the wisest king, who was also considered sometimes a fool because of his uxoriousness. If you remember, Milton in Paradise Lost, Book 1, refers to Solomon, who was a fool because he followed his wife's advice and worshipped gods of other religions. So the scoffer is introduced. There chanced to stand by a certain jesting parasite or scoffer, which would seem to resemble and counterfeit the fool. Now, in every court in Europe, there would be a fool. So here, the cardinal's palace, it can be considered the cardinal's court, and there also you find this parasite or a fool. But he did in such wise counterfeit that he was almost the very same indeed that he labored to represent. So he tried to play the role of a fool, but actually he was a fool or genuine fool, and therefore he did not have to work so hard to represent it. So he tried to bring forth or tried to speak in a humorous manner, which fell so flat because his jokes were stupid, so that on the contrary brought out his foolishness or stupidity. Yet the foolish fellow brought out now and then such indifferent and reasonable stuff that he made the proverb true which said, "He that shooteth oft at the last shall hit the mark." Now sometimes his words would appear to be right. So you see that more here is using the topos of the wise fool, the notion used by Erasmus also, that is, it is a Renaissance paradox also, that the fool is often proved to be wise in his speeches, which criticize the customs of the day and show their defects or their emptiness. So here Raphael says that the proverb that who shoots off often, frequently, his arrows would sometimes hit the mark, that is, even if by accident. So that does not necessarily prove that he is very wise. Similarly, the words of this man also sometimes would be correct. So he said, "Let me alone with them," that is, with the vagabonds and the poor. "You shall see me do well enough with them, for I had rather than any good that this kind of people were driven somewhere out of my sight. They have so troubled me many times, and oft when they have with their lamentable tears begged money of me. And yet they could never to my mind so tune their song, that thereby they even got of me one farthing." That is, beggars, when come to beg, I would not give them even one farthing. "For evermore the one of these two chanced, either that I would not or else that I could not." So when they realized that this person will not give alms, then they would leave him. "But I will make a law that all these beggars shall be distributed and bestowed into houses of religion. The men shall be made lay brethren, as they call them, and the women nuns." So he says that the best way to deal with these beggars and parasites, is by making them enter the houses of religion, that is monasteries, and they would be either monks or nuns. So this is an attack, we may say, on not religion, but the monks and nuns who fail to follow their holy pursuit and who indulge in luxury or behavior that they should not. So you realize that this is in the reformist tradition, in the tradition of the Reformation, though the Reformation was most probably, yes, yet to take place. But in the writings of Erasmus and More, we already find a lot of criticism of people belonging to different religious orders. So even though both Erasmus and More were extremely religion-minded people, Erasmus uh, was a monk, but then he left the monastery and started to live secular life, we may say, or intellectual life. And More also wanted to be a monk, but then he became a courtier. But nevertheless, both of them are extremely religious people, both of them Roman Catholics, and since there was this, almost mature atmosphere, mature for the Reformation to take place. I mean, Luther would, begin the Reformation movement. So we see that both Erasmus and More, they demonstrate the fact that they were well aware of the defects of the church or of the clergy, and that is why in the Praise of Folly we find priests, monks, clergymen, nuns. They are all severely satirized, and here also we find this point taken up, but humorously. So the lawyer says that it is best that the beggars join the holy orders. And here the cardinal smiled and allowed it in jest, and all the residue in good earnest. So the cardinal himself is an official in the Roman Catholic Church, but he demonstrates his good humor and allows this in jest, because this person is almost like a fool, and a court fool is allowed to say whatever he thinks. But this humor was absent in a friar who was also there. So the friar took this, dig at the religious men seriously. But a certain friar, graduate in divinity, took such pleasure and delight in this jest of priests and monks that he, also being else a man of grisly and stern gravity, began merrily and wantonly to jest and taunt. Nay, quoth he, you shall not so be rid and dispatched of beggars, unless you make some provision also for us friars. So originally the friar was also in a jesting mood, trying to reply to this jest by saying that no, you must also take into consideration the friars, because they also beg from door to door. And then the jester, that is the scoffer, he said, why, that is done already, for my Lord himself set a very good order for you, when he decreed that vagabonds should be kept straight and set to work, for you be the greatest and various vagabonds that be. So you see that a direct attack or a direct criticism of friars, monks who beg from place to place, and he compares them to vagabonds and says that you should be rather made to work. So why should you, be parasites upon other men's labor? You should rather work. And at this, the friar became very angry. And the cardinal did not say anything against this jest either. So the friar, for he, being thus touched on the quick and hit on the gall, so fretted, so fumed and chafed at it, and was in such a rage that he could not refrain himself from chiding, scolding, railing and reviling. He called the fellow ribald, villain, javel, backbiter, slanderer, and the child of perdition, citing therewith terrible threatenings out of Holy Scripture. So you see that the friar lost his humor or his temperament and became very angry at the scoffer. So More's purpose here is to create humor, but at the same time point out this, this very ripe problem in society, the problem with the churchmen, that they often lived as parasites on other people's labor and assumed wealth and indulged in luxury. So when the cardinal speaks to him, speaks gently to the friar and tries to mollify him, but the friar is still very angry. No, forsooth, my lord, quoth he, I should not do more wisely. So when the cardinal tells him to be wise and not to be angry, then he said, no, I will not be wise. For Solomon the wise said, answer a fool according to his folly, like as I do now, and to show him the pit that he shall fall into, if he take not heed. For if many scorners of Helizeus, which was but one bald man, felt the zeal of the bald, how much more shall one scorner of many friars feel, among whom be many bald men? And we have also the Pope's bulls, whereby all that mock and scorn us be excommunicated, suspended, and accursed. So he is so angry with the jester that he says that they would all be accursed. They would all be accursed, and the Pope has this order that anybody who scorns at holy men, they should be excommunicated. The cardinal, seeing that no end would be made, sent away the jester by a privivec and turned the communication to another matter. Then the character More tells Raphael that he is extremely happy to listen to his speech. So there is a brief dialogue between More and Raphael, and then the argument whether a wise man should enter into public service or not, that argument is taken up again. So Raphael says, for whereas your Plato judgeth that will public shall by this means attain perfect felicity, either if philosophers be kings, or else if kings give themselves to the study of philosophy, how far, I pray you, shall commonwealths then be from this felicity, if philosophers will vouchsafe to instruct kings with their good counsel? So there is probably a textual error here. It should be not vouchsafe. So he says that you talk about Plato and Plato's idea that either philosophers should be rulers of a commonwealth, or the kings should listen to the advice of the philosophers in the matter of ruling, and how far will the commonwealth be from felicity, that is from happiness, if philosophers decline to instruct kings? Raphael asks. And More says, they be not so unkind, he continues, they be not so unkind, but they would gladly do it, yeah, many have done it already in books and that they have put forth, if kings and princes would be willing and ready to follow good counsel. So he says that philosophers will probably not decline in helping the kings. In a way, they have already helped the kings by writing and publishing many wise books. So if the kings actually needed the advice from philosophers, then he might as well read their books and apply their instructions. But Plato doubtless did well foresee, unless kings themselves would apply their minds to the study of philosophy, that else they would never thoroughly allow the counsel of philosophers, being themselves before, even from their tender age, infected and corrupt with perverse and evil opinions. So Raphael says that Plato could also surmise, could guess, that unless a king has a philosophical bent of mind and is willing to listen to the advice of philosophers, he will not heed to their advice. And most kings, they are not wise or of philosophical temperament, and their minds are infected with evil corruption. What is this evil corruption? That is worldly desire. the desire to possess more, to have more power and so on. So their minds are already infected, and therefore they won't be able to appreciate the advice of the philosopher. And then he gives more an example. And he gives the example of the French king, that is Francois I, a very powerful king at that time. So I suppose if I were the French king, and then if I gave him advice. Now the French king was well known for his desire to expand his empire. The king and the other councillors in his court, they beat their brains and search the very bottoms of their wits to discuss by what craft and means the king may still keep Milan and draw to him again fugitive Naples, and then how to conquer the Venetians, and how to bring under his jurisdiction all Italy, then how to win the dominion of Flanders, Brabant, and of all Burgundy, with divers other lands, whose kingdoms he had long ago in mind and purpose invaded. So this desire of the French, the French had conquered parts of Italy. The desire of the French to conquer so many provinces of Italy and to keep them in their dominion, in their empire. If I were a member of the court of the French king, and if I had advised him not to expand his empire, not to focus on expansion of empire, but to focus on good administration of his kingdom, would he have listened to my advice? When all other courtiers were also bent upon advising him, telling him what he wants to hear, that is how to conquer other countries. So he gives example of various courtiers giving him the counsel. Some tell him to hire the German soldiers. Another would have the favor of the Swiss, own with the money. Swiss soldiers were famous mercenaries. They were hired for money. Another's advice is to appease the puissant power of the emperor's majesty with gold, as with a most pleasant and acceptable sacrifice, to bribe the emperor. And another's advice, while another giveth counsel to make peace with the king of Aragon, not to restore unto him his own kingdom of Navarre as a full assurance of, and to restore him the kingdom of Navarre as a full assurance of peace. That is, he would advise the French king to enter into a treaty with the king of Aragon, another powerful king, and to return him the kingdom of Navarre. And somebody advises him to hook in the king of Castile with some hope of affinity or alliance, to build an alliance with the king of Castile, and so on. When they all stay at the chiefest doubt of all what to do in the meantime with England. So for the French king Francois I, it was easier to deal with the kings of Europe, and even though there was the emperor in Europe, Francois himself was ambitious to be the emperor, but he could not become the emperor. Charles was the emperor. Now it would be easier for him, or it were easier for him to deal with the European kings, but when it came to the question of England, then it was a big problem for him, because Henry VIII was a very powerful monarch, and therefore the courtiers won't know what to tell him, what to suggest him regarding England, while they all stay at the chiefest doubt of all what to do in the meantime with England, and yet agree all in this to make peace with the Englishmen, and with most sure and strong bands to bind that weak and feeble friendship, so that they must be called friends, and had in readiness, as it were, in a standing ready at all occasions. Notice the Englishmen should stir never so little incontinent to set upon them. So they would advise that the best thing would be to have a friendship or a treaty of friendship with England, so that the Englishmen do not attack them. So even though it would be an uneasy friendship, but since the English king was very powerful, that should be the policy. He also talks about some peer of England, that is banished his country, which must claim title to the crown of the realm, and affirm himself just inherited thereof, that by this subtle means they may hold to them the king, in whom else they have but small trust and affiance. So since from the time of Henry VIII, England was leaning towards Protestantism. Even though Henry was Roman Catholic, but he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, a Protestant girl, and he was leaning towards Protestantism. So some noblemen, some Englishmen who might have claimed to the title of the king, they had fled to France, and such people could be won over against the King of England. And then Raphael goes on to talk about the vanity and futility of war. Here I say, where so great and high matters be in consultation, where so many noble and wise men content their king only to war, here if I, silly man, should rise up and will them to turn over the leaf and learn a new lesson, saying that my counsel is not to meddle with Italy, but to tarry still at home, and that the kingdom of France alone is almost greater than that it may well be governed of one man, so that the king should not need to study how to get more, and then should propose unto them the decrees of the people that be called the Acorians, which be situate over against the island of Utopia on the southeast side. So he gives the example of another nation, the Acorians, who live on the southeast side of Utopia. He says that if I suggest the king of France that he should not go to war because his kingdom is already very great for one man to rule, so he should focus on his country rather than expanding his empire, then would my suggestion be accepted? He gives the example of the Acorians who made war in their king's quarrel for to get him another kingdom. So the king of the Acorians wanted to expand his kingdom and conquer a nearby country, and the people supported the king. But when he at last got it, the other country, then he found that it was easy to conquer the country, but it was very difficult to retain it, because the people of that country were constantly in rebellion, and therefore the fight would continuously go on, and there would be no peace, and the treasury would be exhausted in continuing the fight. And gradually the Acorians themselves came to realize that conquering another country did not help them at all. So it would be better to let it go rather than keep it and continuously try to hold on to something which is difficult. So this good prince was constrained to be content with his old kingdom and to give over the new to one of his friends, who shortly after was violently driven out. So the people of the country did not want it, and the king was forced to give up the country. He gave it away to one of his friends, who was later driven out by the rebels. So Raphael says, if I give this example of the Acorians to the French king, would he listen to me? Furthermore, if I should declare unto them that all this busy preparance for war, whereby so many nations for his sake should be brought into a troublesome hurly-burly, when all his coffers were emptied, his treasures wasted, and his people destroyed, should at the length through some mischance be in vain and to none effect, and that therefore it were best for him to content himself with his own kingdom of France, and so on. Seeing that which he has already is even enough for him, and more than he can well turn him to. This mine advice, Master More, how think it would be hard and taken? So if I give the French king this advice, then you tell me, would he accept it? And since More was also a diplomat and a courtier, he knew what kind of advice would be accepted by a king and which would be not. So God help me not very thankfully, quoth I. So More says, no, your advice will not be accepted thankfully. Therefore the whole argument, More's argument, that a wise man, Raphael being a wise man, he should join the court of a king and advise him. This argument falls flat because More himself is compelled to admit that ambitious kings won't accept the wise advice of the philosopher or a wise man. So this argument is further elaborated by Raphael. He goes on to explain why a wise man is not acceptable to a king. And then he comes to the conclusion, the bottom of page 48, where he talks about the greed of kings. To conclude, all the councillors agree and consent together with the rich Crassus that no abundance of gold can be sufficient for a prince, which must keep and maintain an army. Furthermore, that a king, though he would, can do nothing unjustly, for all that all men have, yea, also the men themselves be all his. So the kings can never be satisfied. The more gold he has, the more he wants, because he thinks of continuing the expansion of his empire, for which he has to have a large army, and for this army, however much gold he might have, that would never be adequate. And besides, a king thinks that by virtue of being a king, he is the owner of all property, all gold, and even all men. Therefore, the greed of a king would be unlimited. It would never be satiated. Then Raphael says that instead of being greedy, a king should, on the other hand, remember that his purpose is to serve his people. Here again, if I should rise up and boldly affirm that all these counsels be to the king dishonor and reproach, that is, the counsel of other courtiers to continue with war. This is a dishonor and reproach, whose honor and safety is more and rather supported and upholden by the wealth and riches of his people than by his own treasures. So if the people of a nation they are rich, then that gives more honor to the king as a good ruler than by the personal wealth of the king. And if I should declare that the commonalty chooseth their king for their own sake and not for his sake, so it is the interest of the people which matters the most, not the interest of the king, to the intent that through his labor and study they might all live wealthily, safe from wrongs and injuries. So the king should ensure that all people live safely, and also they become rich. And that therefore the king ought to take more care for the wealth of his people than for his own wealth, even as the office and duty of a shepherd is, in that he is a shepherd to feed his sheep rather than himself. So this metaphor, as you understand, is taken from the Bible. So the king is only a shepherd to his people. That's just like a shepherd leads his flock of sheep and provides them with food and safety. Similarly, a king should lead his people towards safety, wealth, and well-being. And therefore, if the people are poor, if there is always risk of foreign invasion, or if there is continuous war, when sometimes civilians are also harmed by the enemy army, then the king is not actually protecting his country or his people. Therefore, what should a king do according to Raphael? But let him rather amend his own life, renounce unhonest pleasures and forsake pride. So you see how that even in the in this small book, this discourse of Raphael that is drawn in the manner of a manual for kings or princes, which was a favorite topic with the humanists. Even Erasmus had a book on the code of the princes. So what are the virtues? He should amend his own life, renounce unhonest pleasures and forsake pride. For these be the chief vices that cause him to run in the contempt or hatred of his people. Let him live of his own, hurting no man. Let him do cost not above his power. Let him restrain wickedness. Let him prevent vices and take away the occasions of offences by well ordering his subjects, and not by suffering wickedness to increase, afterward to be punished. Suffering means allowing. So a king should not allow the wickedness to increase first and later punish the wicked. He should preempt such wickedness or crime. And let him never, under the cloak and pretense of transgression, take such fine and forfeits as no judge will suffer a private person to take, as unjust and full of guile. So, fine and forfeit, these public fines, they always go to the treasury of the king. But what right the king has to take this money? Now we may ask that our governments also, because you violate a traffic rule, immediately you pay fine to the government, that goes to government treasury. So we are paying fines, we are paying taxes, at every step all that money goes to the government. So here Raphael says that why should the king increase his own wealth? And then Raphael gives example of another nation, the Macarians. Now we see that before the second book of Utopia, where the utopian nation is described, before that in book 1 we have a number of small but alien nations are being described. Polylerites, Acorians, Macarians. This prepares us for encountering the strangest nation, that is the utopians. But this also is a kind of othering, as you will understand from the post-colonial discourse. That is, the sense of nationality or national identity can be established by comparing itself with the identity of the other nations, which was the practice of the Europeans, to always put self and other counter in an encounter with each other. So the practice of the other nations are different from that of the English. So if you look at their practices, then you understand the difference, and you can therefore be in a position to judge whether your practices are superior or inferior. The Macarians, which be not far distant from Utopia, whose king the day of his coronation is bound by a solemn oath that he shall never at any time have in his treasure above 1,000 pounds of gold or silver. So there is a ceiling to the amount of money that can be kept in the treasury. It is not more than 1,000 pounds, which suggests that the king's treasury should not hoard wealth, because the king is there only to rule the people by the people's consent, and he is not there to increase his own wealth. They say a very good king which took more care for the wealth and commodity of his country than for enriching of himself made this law to be a stop and a bar to kings from heaping and hoarding up so much money as might impoverish their people. So if the king grows rich by taxing the people or fining the people, then the people become impoverished. The people get poor. So to stop that, the Macarians go by this rule. For how can so strange informations be profitable, or how can they be beaten into their heads, whose minds be already prevented with clean contrary persuasions? Raphael asks, how can the kings be persuaded to follow the advice of the wise people, because their heads are already crammed with pernicious principles? This school philosophy is not unpleasant among friends in familiar communication, but in the councils of kings, where great matters be debated and reasoned with great authority, these things have no place. School philosophy or wisdom has no place in a king's court, because they discuss more ambitious things. That is it which I meant, quoth he, when I said philosophy had no place among kings. Then More tries to provide a counter argument to Raphael by saying, yes, this school philosophy does not have a place among kings, which thinks that all things meet for every place. But there is another philosophy more civil, which knoweth, as you would say, her own stage, and thereafter ordering and behaving herself in the play that she hath in hand, playeth her part accordingly with comeliness, uttering nothing out of due order and fashion. And this is the philosophy that you must use, or else whilst the comedy of Plotus is playing and the vile bondmen scoffing and trifling among themselves, if you should suddenly come upon the stage in a philosopher's apparel and rehearse out of Octavia the place wherein Seneca disputed with Nero, had it not been better for you to have played the dumb person, than by rehearsing that which served neither for the time nor place, to have made such a tragical comedy or volume-affray? So More says that if you try to provide the kind of wisdom that you talk about in a court which is very ambitious, then it is as out of context as in a Roman theatre, where in a comedy by Plotus, where a philosopher appears where servants are quarreling, and therefore the philosopher is completely out of context and he is not understood by the characters on stage. So there is no point being out of context. So the case standeth in a commonwealth, and so it is in the consultation of kings and princes, which means that More wants to say that you should understand that as a courtier you must be diplomatic, and the kind of advice that is acceptable in a court, you will provide that advice. So if evil opinions and naughty persuasions cannot be utterly and quite plucked out of their hearts, if you cannot even as you would remedy vices which use and custom hath confirmed, yet for this cause you must not leave and forsake the commonwealth. You must not forsake the ship in a tempest, because you cannot rule and keep down the winds. So here More offers the strongest advice, or the strongest argument about joining public service. That is, you must, as a part of the commonwealth, you must feel your responsibility to help in the progress of the commonwealth. And he gives the example of a ship in a storm, and one should not abandon the ship just because one cannot control the winds. So what should one do? One should still try hard or harder and try to bring the ship in control in spite of the raging storm. So abandoning the commonwealth means, you know, not performing your responsibility or your loyalty to the state. No, nor you must not labor to drive into their heads new and strange information, which you know well shall be nothing regarded with them that be of clean contrary minds. The kings are of contrary minds. You cannot force them to accept such information. But you must with a crafty wile and a subtle train study and endeavour yourself as much as in you lieth to handle the matter wittily and handsomely for the purpose. So you see the words that More uses, I mean, of course, he uses Latin words, but here we see the translation. Crafty, wile, subtle, and witty, and so on. So the courtier must be diplomatic, crafty, hypocritical, subtle, to advise, in advising the king. He must not be, he must not act in a stupid way. He must realize what kind of advice would be favored by the king and what not. But it still remains his responsibility to advise the king. And that which you cannot turn to good, so to order it that it be not very bad. So if you cannot make the king completely in favor of the people and taking all positive actions, if you cannot reform the king, then you can at least stop him from being a bad king, or a king who takes actions which are injurious to the people. So you must endeavor to control the king's actions so that they do not go the wrong way and injure the people. For it is not possible for all things to be well unless all men were good. So that is an idea which never happens in our world. All men can never be good, and all things therefore cannot be well. So there will always be imperfections, but that should not be your ground for abandoning an attempt to improve things, which I think will not be yet these good many years. So not in near future that the world is going to be a better place or a more perfect place. So we see that More offers here, Raphael, a worldly argument. That is, you must be also able to understand that the world is imperfect. So you must not be completely idealistic, but you must also be a realist and realize that you can only do so much, that your actions have limited role. And that should not dishearten you. That should not make you stop from trying to do what you can do or from trying to advise the king. So we may say that in this advice or in this argument there is some kind of pragmatism, to be wise, to appreciate the reality and not to be an idealist. But there is also a tone of melancholy, I would say, that the world is not only imperfect, but for many years to come, I do not see it becoming any better. So, and this is completely in harmony with Thomas More's personal experience in life. Not only he failed in persuading Henry in following the course of divorce, or for that matter in siding with the Reformation, but he received harsh punishment from the king. But that did not stop him from being the courtier that he was, or from being the wise man that he was. So even when imprisoned in the tower, he was writing the dialogue of comfort, a dialogue we may say which is about moral philosophy. It is what should be our attitude to this world. And More's attitude represented in this argument is not a pessimistic attitude. So he remains a man of action. And this is a fine balance of active life and contemplative life, as I was telling you in the last class. So Raphael stands for the point of view of the vita contemplativa to some extent, insofar as he speaks about the Platonic idea of a philosopher. So the philosopher that Raphael presents here is a philosopher who does not make any compromise with his ideals. But the philosopher or the wise man that More thinks about is a wise man whose wisdom is tempered by reality or by perception of reality.